The Velkari delegate laughed. Not a polite, diplomatic chuckle. Not a small, embarrassed sound that could be mistaken for a cough. It was a full, open-mouthed, chest-deep laugh. The kind that fills a room and empties all the air out of it at the same time. The kind of laugh that makes everyone around it either join in or go very quiet. The Galactic Council chamber went very quiet. I was sitting in the translator booth on the second tier, a small glass enclosure with a headset pressed to one ear, and a data screen running live feeds of every delegate's biometric response. My job was simple. Listen to the council session, convert diplomatic language into plain speech for the Earth mission team, and stay invisible. I was good at staying invisible. I had spent 11 years making sure that people, and now, apparently, aliens, did not notice me until it was far too late. The laugh died. The Velkari delegate, a tall creature with pale silver skin and a jaw that split at the chin into two separate hinged sections, leaned forward in his elevated seat and said something in the high tongue. The translator in my ear rendered it a half-second later. "Earth," he said. "A biosphere-class world, carbon-based, oxygen-dependent, single sentient species. No military caste, no natural armor, no venom glands, no echolocation, no hive mind coordination." He paused for effect. "They have submitted a formal request to join the peacekeeping auxiliary at Tier 3. Another round of quiet laughter moved through the chamber like a ripple across still water. "My name is Mara Voss. I am a sergeant in the Earth Unified Ground Force, Jungle Warfare Division. I have spent 11 years crawling through mud, rain, and undergrowth in places that most humans would not survive for a single afternoon. I have hunted things in the dark. I have been hunted in the dark. I have never lost." I kept my face completely still. The Earth ambassador, a careful man named Colin Ward who wore his best diplomatic suit and carried himself with the kind of calm dignity that only people who have spent years being underestimated ever truly develop, stood at the central address platform. He was not laughing. He had not expected the laughter, and he was handling it the way experienced diplomats always handle unexpected humiliation, by pretending it was not happening, and continuing to speak. "Earth's request," Colin said, his voice carrying steady and even through the chamber's acoustic system, "is based on our population's demonstrated history of operating effectively in high-threat environments. Our species has a proven record of adapting to diverse and hostile conditions. We believe we can contribute meaningfully to the auxiliary at any tier the Council considers appropriate." The Velkari delegate raised one long-fingered hand. "Ambassador Ward, please do not mistake our amusement for disrespect." He smiled, and the two halves of his jaw moved independently, which made the smile look very strange. "The Galactic Peacekeeping Auxiliary exists to protect member worlds and maintain order across contested regions. Its members are selected based on demonstrated military capacity, combat potential. We assess species according to a standardized framework. Your world's assessment placed you at Tier 2. Colin kept his expression neutral. "May I ask the range of the tier system?" 1 through 10, the delegate said. 10 being species with the highest verified military capacity, species we consider apex threats. "And what is Tier 2? Colin asked. "Tier 2 represents species which possess enough biological self-awareness to avoid immediate extinction in a conflict zone," the delegate said pleasantly. "It is not an insult. The Quran of the Celis system are also Tier 2. They are lovely beings. They photosynthesize." More laughter. Softer this time, but still there. I took the headset off my ear and set it on the desk. I did not need the translator anymore. I had understood everything perfectly. Behind me, one of the other Earth observers, a young logistics officer named Pete Garland, leaned forward and whispered, "They're comparing us to plants." "I heard," I said. "Do you think the ambassador is going to push back?" "No," I said. "He's too smart for that. You don't push back in a room where you have no leverage. You absorb, you note, and you wait." Pete looked at me sideways. "Is that what you're doing?" "That is exactly what I am doing," I said. Down on the floor, Colin Ward accepted the Council's decision with measured grace. Earth would be assigned to Peacekeeping Auxiliary Tier 2. We would be given non-combat roles, supply escorts, logistical support, medical assistance in low-risk zones. We would not be given weapons authorizations above small arms. We would not be assigned to active conflict regions. We were, in the Council's view, too fragile for real work. We were assigned our first mission briefing that same afternoon, in a narrow conference room with angular walls that clearly had not been designed with human body shapes in mind. A Velkari logistics officer named Sarel walked us through it using a holographic terrain map that projected above the center table. The mission was an escort, a series of supply convoys moving through a region called the Vithara Interior, a dense, triple-canopy jungle zone on a mid-size planet designated V4 by the Empire's cataloging system. The local name for the planet translated roughly as, the place where the light does not reach the ground. The Korvath, a rebel faction that had been operating in V4 for several years, had been hitting supply convoys in the jungle corridors for months. Imperial forces had attempted aerial suppression repeatedly. It had not worked. The jungle canopy was too thick, the rebel positions too mobile. The mission, Sarel said, is low risk by current Empire classification. The Korvath are a nuisance force, not a military threat. You will accompany the supply convoy as a protective presence. Your team will be accompanied by 2 Velkari escort commanders who will oversee operational decisions. Your role is support and observation. I studied the terrain map. The jungle on V4 was extraordinary. Dense layers of canopy, the lowest branch coverage starting at about 40 meters above the ground. Thick root systems, deep shadow corridors, multiple water channels running through the interior. Visibility on the ground would be no more than 15 meters in most directions. The humidity level in the data readout made my fingers itch. That kind of moisture meant noise absorption. Sound did not travel cleanly in that kind of air, which meant that anything could get very close to you before you heard it. I thought, this is not a low-risk mission. I did not say that. I was there to observe. Pete leaned toward me again. Looks pretty rough in there, he whispered, studying the map. It looks like home, I said. He stared at me. You're from Cardiff. I know, I said. But I mean it feels like home. I had been deployed to environments like V4 4 times in my career. The first time was a dense river basin in South America, where my unit spent 3 weeks tracking a weapons trafficking network through undergrowth so thick that we moved on our hands and knees for the last 5 kilometers. The second time was a Southeast Asian interior that the locals called the stomach, because once the jungle swallowed you, it didn't give you back easily. The third and fourth times I had gone in alone, with limited equipment and a specific objective, and I had come out alone both times, carrying exactly what I had gone in to find. I knew what triple canopy jungle smelled like before dawn. I knew what it sounded like when rain was coming from 3 hours away, because the birds changed. I knew which shadows moved and which shadows stayed still, and I knew the difference between a branch shifting in the wind and a branch shifting because something had touched it. The Velkari had spent years dropping explosives from the sky into V4, and wondering why the Korvath kept coming back. I could have told them why. You don't break a jungle force from the air. The jungle is not afraid of the sky. The jungle lives underground, in root systems, and tunnel networks, and shadow corridors, where light never reaches. You don't fight the jungle from above. You have to go in. You have to become part of it. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every piece of available data on the Vithara interior. Elevation maps, soil density readings, rainfall patterns, fauna classifications. I paid particular attention to the fauna. On V4, the undergrowth was host to at least 12 species that were either venomous, large, or both. The Velkari data files listed them as environmental hazards, and noted that Velkari soldiers required full biosuits and chemical deterrents when operating in the interior. I made a note that the human team would need their standard jungle boots, moisture-wicking base layers, and insect repellent. I crossed out the insect repellent. The smell would carry. There were 3 others on my team, and they were the best people I had ever worked with. Corporal Deng Liang had spent 7 years as a point man in environments ranging from boreal forest to mangrove swamp. He could read a trail the way other people read a newspaper, quickly, quietly, with complete understanding of everything being said. He was the kind of man who could walk through a room full of people, and nobody would remember he had been there. In a jungle, he was essentially a ghost who happened to breathe. Warrant Officer Lena Pham was our medic and navigator. She had a mind that worked like a very fast, very calm computer. In the field, she moved without hurrying and made decisions without visible stress. She had treated wounds in environments where the nearest proper medical facility was 3 days of walking in the wrong direction, and she had never lost a patient who was still alive when she reached them. Private Owen Adler had come to us from explosive ordnance disposal, which meant he had spent years of his life very carefully handling things that wanted to end it. He was methodical, precise, and possessed of the particular brand of dark humor that people develop when they work with dangerous materials for long enough that the danger stops feeling strange. He could rig a charge to bring down a structure, or defuse one that somebody else had placed, with the same level of calm detachment that other people use to tie their shoes. We were 4 people. The Valkyrie had given us 2 commanders and a security escort of 12 soldiers, which meant that on paper, the mission had 16 people and felt well-staffed. In practice, what it meant was that we had 12 soldiers who would struggle in a triple canopy jungle environment, and 2 commanders who had never operated below the canopy at all. I sat with my team in the transport bay the night before departure, and we went over the data together. Nobody spoke much. Deng traced his finger over the terrain map's water channels. Lena cross-referenced the fauna database with her medical kit inventory. Owen studied the structural composition of the supply convoy vehicles with the careful attention of someone who was already thinking about what they could be turned into in an emergency. I watched them and felt something settle quietly in my chest. Not confidence exactly. Something older and simpler than confidence. Readiness. They think this is simple, Owen said, without looking up from the data screen. They think we're simple, Deng said. Let them think that, I said. We departed at dawn the next morning. The transport descended through V4's upper atmosphere and punched through the cloud layer into heavy gray light. Below us, the jungle spread in every direction to the horizon, an ocean of dark green so dense and textured that it looked almost solid from above. No roads, no clearings visible from altitude, just the canopy, broken only by the thin silver threads of rivers cutting their way through the interior. The Valkyrie escort commander, a rigid, silver-uniformed officer named Vreeland, who had the posture of someone who had never once been comfortable, looked out the transport window at the jungle below with visible unease. The convoy route has been pre-cleared, he said, not looking at me. We will maintain formation. If contact is made, my soldiers will engage from defensive positions, while a distress signal is relayed to the nearest Imperial station. How long does relay take? I asked. 40 minutes for a response unit to reach our position. Understood, I said. I looked out the window at the jungle. The transport was descending now, dropping toward a small cleared landing zone that had been cut into the canopy edge at the convoy's staging point. The trees came up on either side of us, enormous and ancient, closing over the transport's view of the sky. The moment we were below the canopy, the world changed. The light went green-gray and close. Sound became muffled, and then was replaced by the dense, layered noise of the jungle itself. Insects, water, wind moving through leaves far above, the distant call of something large and unhurried somewhere to the east. Vreeland pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck where his biosensor was attached, and said something in Valkyrie that my earpiece translated as, atmospheric contamination within acceptable range, visibility severely compromised. I breathed in. The air was thick with moisture, rotting vegetation, rich soil, and something floral and sharp that I didn't have a name for yet, but would by tomorrow morning. My boots touched the ground and sank slightly into the soft upper layer of the soil, before finding the firm base beneath. I looked at Deng. He was already scanning the tree line, his eyes moving in that quiet, systematic way of his, not looking for anything specific, just reading. Reading the way the light fell, the way the undergrowth sat, whether anything had disturbed the natural pattern of things. He caught my eye and tilted his head slightly to the left. Someone had walked through the tree line in the last 6 hours. The ferns on the north-facing edge were bent inward, toward the landing zone. Not wind, not an animal following a regular path. Deliberate, low, careful movement, close to the ground. We had been watched since before we arrived. I did not mention this to Commander Vreeland. There was no point. He would have ordered a perimeter search, which would have told whoever was watching us exactly what we knew. Instead, I adjusted the strap on my rifle, turned my face to the jungle, and let the jungle look back at me. It was an old conversation, one I had been having for most of my adult life. The convoy was waiting at the staging point. 6 heavy supply vehicles loaded with medical equipment, construction materials, and food provisions destined for a civilian settlement in the interior. The vehicles were large, imperial grade, and built for durability rather than stealth. They would be loud, slow, and visible. Moving them through the jungle corridor would take 2 full days at minimum. I walked the length of the convoy slowly, running my eye over the load distribution, the clearance heights, the turning radius of each vehicle. I noted the places where the corridor would narrow and force the convoy to slow. I noted the angles. I noted the shadow lines on either side of the route. 40 minutes for a response unit. A lot happened in 40 minutes. I came back to where Deng was standing near the first vehicle and said quietly, "What did you see?" 6 separate observation positions in the tree line, he said, equally quietly. They moved south after we landed. But they weren't running. They were walking. Organized. How many? Based on soil disturbance pattern, I would say between 8 and 12 individuals, moving in 2 separate groups. They didn't spook, I said. No, Deng said. They didn't spook. That was the thing about a force that didn't spook when you arrived. It meant they were not afraid of you. It meant they had seen whatever you were before and found it manageable. It meant they had a plan, and your arrival was already part of it. I thought about that while Commander Vreeland organized his soldiers into a flanking formation around the convoy and announced that we would begin moving in 20 minutes. I thought about what it meant to be underestimated. I thought about the council chamber and the sound of that laugh. Then I walked to my position at the convoy's rear and began the slow, careful work of paying attention to everything. The jungle on V4 did not ease you in. It started immediately, in the first 10 meters past the staging point, with root systems that rose from the soil like the knuckles of buried giants, and forced every step into a deliberate, careful negotiation between your foot and the ground. The convoy vehicles handled the roots by brute force, their hydraulic suspension systems grinding and adjusting with every contact. The noise they made was considerable. I walked behind the last vehicle and listened to the jungle around the noise. Most people, when they are placed in a dense, unfamiliar environment, make the mistake of trying to see everything. Their eyes move fast. They scan, jump, sweep. It feels like vigilance, but it is actually the opposite of vigilance, because fast eyes miss everything that is standing still. The jungle did not reveal itself to people who looked at it frantically. It revealed itself only to people who slowed down enough to let it come to them. I moved at a pace slightly slower than the rear vehicle, and kept my eyes soft. Not unfocused, soft. There is a difference. Soft eyes take in the whole field of vision at once, without committing to any single point of it, which means that movement, when it happens anywhere in the frame, registers immediately. In the first hour, I cataloged the following: a large 6-limbed reptile, approximately the size of a Labrador retriever, moving parallel to us through the undergrowth on our left side, curious but not aggressive, a colony of something that looked approximately like ants, but was clearly not ants, building a structure in the base of a hollow tree that we passed. 3 separate water sources, 2 of them moving, 1 still, and the fact that the bird sounds, the steady, layered background noise of the jungle's avian population, had shifted approximately 20 minutes into our march. They had shifted in a specific direction, northeast of our line of travel. In a jungle, birds do not go quiet randomly. They go quiet because something has moved through their territory that they are not comfortable with, something that does not belong to their normal pattern of experience. The birds near us were still calling. The birds to our northeast had stopped. Something was moving through the jungle to our northeast, and the birds had decided to say nothing while it passed. I opened my comm and spoke quietly to Deng, who was walking 300 meters ahead of the convoy. Northeast. Something moving parallel. A pause. Then Deng's voice, barely above a murmur. Copy. I flagged it 4 minutes ago. They've been holding that distance, not closing. Pacing us, I said. Pacing us, he confirmed. Commander Vreeland's voice entered the channel, clipped and official. Report. What have you identified? Possible observation element to our northeast, I said. Maintaining parallel course. Distance approximately 400 meters. A longer pause. You identified this from bird behavior? Yes, Commander. Another pause. The kind that meant he was trying to decide whether to take that seriously or file it under human strangeness and move on. Can you confirm by direct visual? Not at this distance through this canopy, but the pattern is consistent. Noted, Vreeland said. Maintain course. My sensors show no heat signatures in that quadrant. I did not point out that triple canopy jungle at 90% humidity did complicated things to heat signature technology. I had seen military-grade thermal equipment fail in environments like this before. The moisture in the air absorbed and scattered infrared output in ways that the technology had not been designed to handle. On top of that, any force that had been operating in V4 for as long as the Corvette had would know how to screen against sensor sweeps. You learned the tools of your enemy, and you worked around them. That was the first lesson of operating in a contested environment. I lowered the comm and kept walking. The convoy stopped for a midday rest, 2 hours later, at a slight widening of the corridor, where the routes thinned enough to allow the vehicles to pull off the main track. The Valkyrie soldiers arranged themselves around the vehicles in a rough perimeter formation, which was correct procedure, and would have been very effective in an open terrain engagement. In the jungle, a perimeter formation meant you were standing in a circle, watching 15 meters of undergrowth in every direction, and anything that wanted to observe you simply had to sit more than 15 meters away and wait. Lena came and stood next to me where I had positioned myself at the northern edge of the rest stop, with my back to a root buttress that came up to my shoulder and gave me clear sight lines along 2 separate undergrowth channels. "Water source 200 meters north," she said. I could hear it when we stopped. "I heard it too. I went to look," she said. I turned to face her fully. "Alone?" "I was very fast," she said. "I went east around the route line, not straight north, less visible. The water channel has recent crossing marks, a lot of them, multiple individuals crossing at the same point, within the last 12 hours. The crossing point has been used repeatedly. You can see the stones have been moved to make it easier. A deliberate crossing point, a regular crossing point, which meant a regular route, which meant a regular destination, which meant a base of operations somewhere to the north of our current position. "Did you disturb anything at the crossing?" I asked. I crouched at the edge and looked from the undergrowth. "I didn't step into the channel." She looked at me steadily. "I've done this before, Mara." "I know you have," I said. "Good work." I did not report this to Vreeland. The information was mine to use, and I would use it correctly when the time came. Giving it to a commander who would respond by calling for a sweep team and a sensor deployment would waste it. Information in the field was only as valuable as your ability to act on it intelligently. We moved again, after the rest break, and the afternoon light began to change, the green deepening toward the blue-gray of approaching evening. The jungle sounds changed with it. The daytime insects quietened, and the first of the night insects began their warm-up, a thin, oscillating sound underneath everything else. Something large and unseen moved through the upper canopy to our west, moving fast, branches shaking and then settling. Owen fell into step beside me. He had been walking in the middle of the convoy formation, watching the vehicles. He didn't say anything for a while. Owen generally didn't say things until he had finished thinking them all the way through. "Third vehicle from the front," he said finally. "Left rear load strapping is loose. If we hit a significant route impact, the load shifts. Could cause a rollover on the next stretch where the corridor slopes. Can you fix it?" Already asked one of the Valkyrie soldiers to help me. He looked at me like I'd asked him to swim across the water channel. Owen paused. "I fixed it myself. Took 4 minutes." "Noted," I said. "Also," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, becoming more careful. "I checked the undercarriage of the second vehicle during the rest stop." I looked at him. "There's something attached to it," he said, "behind the third axle housing. Small. Placed there with a magnetic coupling. I didn't touch it." I stopped walking. He stopped with me. "When?" I said. "Could have been placed at the staging point before we departed, or at any point during the march when the convoy vehicles were stationary." He looked at me with that level, professional calm he always carried. "It's not a large device. The placement and the housing size suggest it's a tracker, rather than a destructive charge. A tracker, which meant the Corvette did not need to follow us at distance. They already knew exactly where we were going, because they had attached a device to the vehicle that told them, which meant the parallel movement to our northeast was not reconnaissance. It was preparation. "How long do we have before we stop for the night?" I said. Vreeland said another 90 minutes of travel, then we make camp. I thought for 3 seconds. "Leave the device. Don't touch it. Don't mention it to anyone except the team." Owen looked at me for a moment, reading the logic. Then he nodded once and moved back to his position in the convoy. A tracker on the vehicle meant that the Corvette knew our route and our timeline. If we removed it, they would know we had found it. If we left it and changed our behavior without appearing to change it, we kept the advantage of knowing they were watching without them knowing we knew. In an engagement where we had significantly less firepower than the opposing force, the only real advantage we had was information. I intended to protect that advantage very carefully. I spent the last 90 minutes of the march thinking about the following: the crossing point Lena had found, the observation element to our northeast, the tracker on the second vehicle, the angle of the corridor ahead, and the fact that we were going to stop for the night in approximately 45 minutes, in a location that the Corvith already knew about. By the time we reached the night camp position, another widening in the corridor, ringed by enormous trees with buttress roots that created natural walls, I had a picture in my mind. It was not a complete picture. There were things I didn't know yet. But the outline was there, and the outline told me that tomorrow morning, very early, before full light, something was going to happen. I briefed my team after the camp was established, while the Velkari soldiers set up their sensor perimeter, and Vreeland conferred with the convoy drivers about the next day's route. We sat together in the shadow of the largest route buttress, speaking very quietly. "They know where we are," I said. "They know where we're going. They have a regular crossing point to our north, which means their primary operational position is somewhere north of this corridor. They've been watching us since before we arrived. They've been watching our route of travel for days. They're not afraid of us," Deng said. "No. They stopped being afraid of the Empire a long time ago. Aerial bombardment didn't change that. A convoy escort of Velkari soldiers didn't change that. But they don't know about us," Owen said. "They know we're here," I said. "But they don't know what we are. We look like the rest of the mission. 2 escort commanders and a support element. Nothing to worry about." Lena was quiet for a moment, looking at the jungle. The night sounds were fully established now. The thick, layered orchestra of everything that lived in the dark on V4. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Tonight? Nothing," I said. "I want to listen. I want to understand their movement pattern before dawn." "Deng, I want you on the north perimeter, not in the sensor line. Find a position in the undergrowth where you can watch the root system between us and the water channel. Don't engage anything. Just watch." Deng nodded. "Owen, check the rest of the convoy vehicles. Don't touch anything you find. Just map them." Owen nodded. "Lena, I need you with the medical kit accessible, and I need you rested. You'll be the most important person on this team tomorrow morning." "You're expecting casualties?" she said. "I'm expecting us to do our jobs," I said, "which means making sure everyone who's hurt gets seen to." I took the first watch myself, sitting in the shadow of the buttress root with the jungle all around me, and I did what I was best at in the world. I listened. I waited. I let the dark settle against me until I was part of it, and I let the jungle talk. 2 hours before dawn, I heard it. The water channel to the north, Lena's crossing point, the particular sound of disturbed water moving in a way that had a pattern to it, not one crossing, multiple crossings, in sequence, organized, careful, deliberate. They were moving into position. I did not raise an alarm. I opened my comm and spoke once, very quietly, to my 3 team members. "Wake up," I said. "They're coming." I sat in the dark and waited, and the jungle closed around me like an old, familiar hand, and for the first time since we had arrived in this galaxy, I felt completely, entirely, almost peacefully at home. Before the first light touched the canopy far above us, I was already moving, not toward the Corveth, but sideways along the eastern edge of the camp, staying low, using the root system as cover, working my way around the outer perimeter in a wide arc that kept me away from the sensor equipment the Velkari had deployed. Their sensors were looking outward. They were not looking along the edge of the camp itself, which was the direction I was moving. There is a thing that happens to the body in the minutes before contact. Some people call it fear. Some people call it adrenaline. I had stopped labeling it years ago and simply learned to use it. The way the hearing sharpened, the way the peripheral vision expanded, the way the sense of smell somehow deepened, picking up information that the conscious mind hadn't registered yet. My hands were steady. My breathing was controlled, slow and quiet. I found a position at the northeast corner of the camp's natural boundary, where 2 enormous root buttresses formed a narrow gap facing toward the water channel. The gap was wide enough to see through but gave me hard cover on both sides. From this position, I had a sight line along the main approach corridor and partial vision into the undergrowth to my left. I pressed against the root, went still, and waited. Deng's voice came through the comm. Barely a sound at all. "I have them," he said. 12 to 15 individuals, moving in 2 elements. The first element is moving to the west of the corridor. The second is moving east, an L-shaped ambush. A classic textbook setup. Position one force along the length of the target's line of travel. Position the second force at the far end of that line to create a crossfire effect and cut off forward movement. You catch the target between two fires, eliminate forward escape, and close the trap from the sides. It was a good plan. Against a supply convoy with a Velkari perimeter guard that would immediately cluster into defensive positions, it would have worked efficiently. The convoy vehicles would provide no real cover against the corvette's position, because the vehicles were exposed on both flanks. The escort soldiers would be caught between the two forces with nowhere to retreat without moving into the second fire line. I had about 8 minutes before the first element reached its trigger position. "Vreeland," I said through the command channel, "we have an incoming ambush formation. 2 elements. West and east of the corridor. First trigger position, 7 to 8 minutes away." A sharp pause. "That is not possible. My sensor perimeter would have flagged." "Your sensor perimeter is fixed. They moved through gaps in the coverage using the root system. Commander, I need you to listen to me right now. Do not move your soldiers into defensive positions. Do not alert the convoy drivers. If you change the visible behavior of the camp before they reach their trigger positions, they will recognize that we know, and they will adjust." Another pause. Shorter. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Until I tell you to." I did not wait for his response. I opened the team channel. "Owen. The second vehicle. The tracker." "I'm at it," Owen said. His voice was from somewhere on the south end of the camp. He had moved there without being told, because Owen understood exactly how the situation worked. "There's also a device under the fourth vehicle. Smaller. Different housing. I think it's a communications disruptor, designed to go active during an engagement to prevent us calling for support," which meant the corvette had placed 2 devices, one to track, one to isolate. They had planned this thoroughly. They had planned it specifically for a Velkari convoy response, cut off communications, eliminate the ability to call for air support or reinforcement, then close the trap at close range where the jungle negated any aerial advantage anyway. It was, genuinely, a very good plan. "Can you neutralize the disruptor without triggering it?" I asked Owen. "Give me 3 minutes," he said. "You have 2, I said. "Deng. Stay in position. Do not engage. I need you mobile, and I need their second element not to know you're there." "Copy," Deng said. "Lena, position? Behind the third vehicle. 2 Velkari soldiers, who asked me what was happening. I told them to stay down, and stay quiet. They listened. Keep them there. Keep yourself there." I settled against the root buttress and watched the undergrowth along the western corridor. The night was not fully dark. V4 had 2 small moons that cast a thin, diffused light through the cloud cover and through the canopy layers, enough to make shapes visible if you knew how to look for them. Enough, if you were patient and you held your position long enough, to see the difference between a fern that was moving in the wind and a fern that was moving because something was very carefully pushing past it. 4 minutes. The western element was almost in position. I could see the slow, deliberate shift of undergrowth along the western edge, moving north to south, spreading out, the attackers taking their individual positions. The sound of a rifle in a triple canopy jungle does not travel the way it does in the open. The canopy absorbs and scatters the report, breaking it into pieces that arrive at the ear from multiple directions at once, so that the exact location of the shooter is almost impossible to identify from sound alone. I had counted on this. I had positioned myself specifically to take advantage of it. I fired 3 times in 4 seconds, not rushed, controlled, deliberate, with a half-breath between each shot to keep the barrel true. The 3 shots went to the 3 center positions of the western fire line, not the ends, the center, where discipline held, and where the collapse of the center would cause the ends to hesitate and reassess rather than advance. Then I moved, not backward, sideways along the northern edge of the western line's position, dropping below the root level, moving east, in a low scramble that covered 8 meters in the time it took the remaining western element members to begin turning around to find the source of fire that had come from behind them. They were looking north when I stopped moving. I was east of them now, and below the root system's upper level, and they were looking in the wrong direction. From the camp below, the Velkari soldiers had gone to the vehicles as ordered. The convoy drivers were down. The camp itself was silent, which was the right thing to be. A visible target returning fire was a target that could be located and adjusted against. A silent camp was a problem. From the eastern element's position, I heard the particular, confused sound of a force that had expected a simple reaction and was getting something else entirely. Through my comm, Deng said 2 words. Going well. I did not have time to smile at this. I was already repositioning again, moving south now, back toward the camp, dropping down through the root system, and coming out near the camp's northern edge. The western element was still trying to locate me to the north. The eastern element was dealing with Deng, which meant the eastern element was not going to have a pleasant next few minutes. I came back into the camp through the root gap and immediately went to the nearest vehicle for cover. From the south side of the convoy, Owen's voice came through the comm. Eastern element is pulling back north. Deng has flanked them. 2 of them ran toward the corridor. They're running into the root system, not back toward the water channel. Let them go, I said. They'll get turned around. Already heading southeast instead of north, Owen said. They'll circle. It'll take them hours to find the crossing point. From the western element's position, there was no more coordinated fire. The 3 center positions were no longer active, and the end positions had pulled back into the undergrowth. Not retreating, regrouping. Trying to understand what had happened, I came around the front of the lead vehicle and found Commander Vraylon standing at the vehicle's flank, his hand on the door frame, watching the tree line. His biosensor was running its readout down the side of his neck. He turned when I appeared. He looked at me for a long moment. The expression on his face was difficult to read. Velkari facial structure was not identical to human, so some of the subtle signals I was used to reading were absent or different. But the wide-set, forward-facing quality of his eyes made some things universal enough. The expression he was wearing was the expression of a person who has just had a belief revised. They retreated, he said. The western element pulled back. The eastern element was flanked and dispersed. I kept my voice professional and level, the way I always did after a contact. Calm voice, steady tone. The debrief could be emotional later, in private. In the field, calm was the most important thing you could project. Deng is tracking the dispersal. He'll come back in within the hour. Vraylon looked at the tree line again. I observed your movement from the camp's perimeter. You went north. You went behind the attacking force. Yes. You identified their position before they engaged. Yes. How did you know exactly where they were? I thought about how to explain this in a way that would make sense to him. The undergrowth on the western side of the corridor had a disturbance pattern, consistent with multiple individuals taking prone positions. The root structure in that area has natural gaps that face south, which makes them good firing positions. A force using L-shaped ambush geometry would use the best available terrain. The western terrain made the western setup obvious once I knew the formation type. Vraylon was quiet for a moment. You identified the formation type from the bird behavior this afternoon. The birds told me the size and direction of the force, I said. The terrain told me where they would position. And you walked around behind them, he said. I walked around behind them, I said. He was quiet again for a longer time. Then he said, carefully, as if he was still processing something large, you hunted them. I thought about the word, about what it meant to him, and what it meant to me, and whether those 2 things were the same. I watched them first, I said. Watching comes before everything else. If you know exactly where something is and what it's doing, it doesn't matter how much larger or stronger it is than you. You've already won the most important part. He looked at me with those wide, forward-facing eyes, and I could see him filing something away, updating something in his internal model of what he was dealing with. Your team, he said. The 4 of you. You communicated during the entire engagement. I monitored the frequency. There were almost no words exchanged. We know each other well, I said. You didn't need words. When you train with people long enough in environments like this, you develop a shared understanding of what the situation requires. Words slow things down. We operate on a read of the situation and a knowledge of what each person will do in any given scenario. He was going to say something else, but Deng appeared from the northern root system at that moment, sliding out of the undergrowth, the way Deng always did, which was as if he had simply always been there and had chosen now to become visible. He came to where we were standing and said, to me, 4 from the eastern element have dispersed east and will not be a problem tonight. The other 3 went north and recrossed the water channel. The western element has fully retreated west. I found their extraction route. They had a secondary path cut through the undergrowth about 60 meters north of their fire line. It was pre-cut. This was a planned withdrawal. A planned withdrawal, which meant this was not an all-or-nothing engagement. The Corvette had come to test the convoy's response, establish their reaction pattern, and withdraw cleanly with what they had learned. Except that what they had learned was going to be very confusing for them. They know something is different, I said to Deng. He nodded slowly. They came for a Valkyrie convoy escort. They got something else. They're going to spend time tonight trying to figure out what. Good, I said. Let them spend time on that. Lena appeared from behind the third vehicle. She was carrying her medical kit and had a focused, efficient look on her face that meant she had already assessed what needed to be done. One of the Valkyrie soldiers took a ricochet off the second vehicle's door panel during the Eastern Element's initial shot. Not serious. Surface wound on the forearm. I've already treated it. The 2 soldiers who stayed with you, I said. Are they all right? They're fine. A little shaken. They kept asking me what was happening. She paused. I told them our team was handling it. They asked if they should go help. I told them to stay where they were. Good call, I said. Owen came around from the south end. He had a data reader in his hand and was scrolling through something. I've mapped all 6 vehicles. Tracker on the second vehicle, disruptor on the fourth, and something interesting on the 6th. He held up the reader. The 6th vehicle has a small device in its cargo bay, accessed from the rear loading panel. Different housing from the other 2. Smaller. Looks like a micro-relay unit, designed to transmit cargo manifest data, rather than position data. So they had 3 devices on the convoy: position tracking, communications disruption, and cargo intelligence. The Corvette knew not only where the convoy was going, but what it was carrying, and when they could expect it to arrive. They had been running this operation for a long time, and they had built a comprehensive intelligence system into it. I looked at the 3 devices' functions in my mind and thought about what they told me about the Corvette operation. You did not build a 3-device intelligence network for a nuisance raid. You built that for a sustained operation with multiple objectives. The supply line disruption was one objective. But what were they doing with the cargo manifest data? They were selecting which convoys to hit and which to ignore. A convoy carrying food and medical supplies to a civilian settlement was different from a convoy carrying military hardware to an imperial garrison. They were reading the cargo before they committed to the engagement, which meant they had a population they were protecting, civilian settlements or sympathetic communities that they did not want to harm by cutting off food and medicine. They were a rebel faction with a care structure, rules of engagement, even if unwritten. I noted this and stored it. Leave all 3 devices in place, I said to Owen. We may need them. He nodded, understanding immediately. Information cut both ways. I went back to the root buttress that had been my position earlier in the night and sat against it. The camp was settling again. The Valkyrie soldiers standing down from alert status with the particular rigid relief of people who had expected to be involved in something and had been kept back from it. Vreeland was sending a mission report to the nearest Imperial relay station. I wondered how he was going to describe what had happened. I also wondered what happened at the relay station when a Valkyrie escort commander filed a report saying that 4 human Tier 2 support personnel had neutralized an ambush that his 12-soldier escort team had not been required to engage. I thought about the council chamber, the laugh, the 6-tooth smile. I thought about something my grandfather had told me when I was 11 years old, and we were sitting at the edge of a forest in early morning, waiting for dawn to come up through the trees. He had been a hunter his entire adult life, and he had spent years teaching me to read the world around me, with the same patience and precision that he used to read a book. He had said, "The animal that thinks you are not a threat has already made the decisive mistake." I had not fully understood that at 11. I had thought he was talking about deer. He was not talking about deer. I sat against the root buttress and listened to V4's jungle return to its night sounds around me, the Corvette withdrawal creating a temporary silence that was already being filled back in by the forest's permanent inhabitants. Somewhere to the north, through the water channel and deep into the canopy, the main body of the Corvette force was sitting in the dark, talking about what had happened tonight. They were going to make a decision about how to respond. I was looking forward to finding out what that decision was. The 4 of us rotated watch through the rest of the night. By dawn, when the canopy far above us began to transmit the thin, greenish light of V4's morning, the jungle had returned fully to itself. The disturbance of the night was absorbed. The birds were calling again. Deng came off watch and sat beside me, accepting the small cup of hot water I had ready, and looked at the jungle with his measuring, quiet eyes. "They left markers," he said. "Tell me." "North side of the water channel, before they crossed. 3 separate cut bark indicators on the root systems, pointing southeast. A directional signal. They were telling someone following later where they went. A communication system using natural materials. Difficult to detect unless you knew what to look for. Impossible to detect if your only surveillance tools were electronic. Can you follow them?" I asked. He looked at me. "Of course I can follow them. Tonight," I said. "After the convoy reaches its destination. You and me." He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup of hot water in his hands. The jungle breathed around us. "Just the two of us," he said. "Just the two of us," I said. He looked at the markers on the root system one more time. Then he looked back at the jungle, at the darkness under the canopy that the morning light hadn't reached yet, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, and not quite anything else. "All right," he said. Tonight, the convoy moved at first light. The vehicles restarted with their grinding mechanical noise, and the Velkari soldiers reformed their escort positions, and we moved south along the corridor, toward the delivery settlement at the interior's edge. Nobody from the Velkari escort said much. Several of them looked at me differently than they had the evening before, but looked away again when I noticed. There was a particular human discomfort in realizing that the person you thought needed protecting is the person who just protected you. I suspected it was not an experience unique to humans. Commander Vreeland walked beside me for part of the morning's travel. He was working something through in his mind. I could see the processing in the way his eyes moved, scanning the jungle but not quite looking at it. The way you stare at a wall, when what you're actually staring at is a problem inside your own head. "I filed my report," he said finally. "I assumed you would. I described the engagement in full detail, the ambush formation, the intelligence devices on the convoy vehicles, and the actions taken by your team to neutralize the threat." He paused. "My reporting officer will forward the report to the Strategic Assessment Division." "That's appropriate," I said. "The Assessment Division's mandate includes threat reclassification for auxiliary units." He said this carefully, as if each word was being placed in a precise position. "Your team's performance last night falls significantly outside the parameters of a Tier 2 support element." "We performed the task we were assigned," I said. "We protected the convoy. You identified an ambush that my sensor equipment failed to detect. You neutralized 2 attacking elements simultaneously, using a force of 4 personnel against a force of approximately 13. You did this without casualties to any member of this convoy, without triggering the communications disruption device, and without revealing to the attacking force that we had compromised their intelligence network." He looked at me directly. "Sergeant Voss, that is not Tier 2 performance." "Commander," I said, "with respect, the tier system is a classification of biological attributes: natural armor, venom capacity, herd coordination. It measures what a species is. It doesn't measure what a species has learned to do." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the corridor ahead of us. "What you have learned to do," he said slowly. "We've been learning for a very long time," I said, "in environments very much like this one." The morning stretched on, and the jungle was quieter than it had been the day before. Not silent. The jungle on V4 was never truly silent, but the quality of the sound had changed. The parallel observation element that had paced us yesterday was gone. The birds to our northeast were calling freely, without that particular interrupted silence that meant something was moving through their territory. The Corvette had pulled back their forward observation. They were reassessing, which gave us a quiet march and a chance to think. I spent the morning considering what I knew about the Corvette operation. The 3-device intelligence system showed sophisticated planning. The L-shaped ambush was a disciplined tactical formation, executed with patience and good terrain use. The pre-cut withdrawal path showed that they planned for both success and retreat. The bark markers Deng had found showed an organized communication system within the jungle environment. This was not a disorganized rebel group running on desperation. This was a structured force with a competent leadership tier and a long-term operational strategy. The Imperial bombardment campaigns had not driven them out because they were too well integrated into the jungle environment to be dislodged from above. They had adapted to the environment the way any force operating in a contested space eventually adapts, by becoming part of it rather than fighting it. I respected that. I could work with it. The settlement appeared mid-afternoon, a cluster of low buildings at the southern edge of the interior, where the jungle canopy thinned slightly and allowed more light to reach the ground. The buildings were constructed from materials that blended with the environment, their lines softened by vegetation that had been encouraged to grow over the surfaces. A deliberate choice. From the air, this settlement would be nearly invisible. The population was small, perhaps 300 individuals, a mix of species, mostly Velkari, but with a significant proportion of others I did not have names for yet. They came out to meet the convoy with the particular, careful caution of a community that had learned not to draw attention to itself. Children, if the small ones were children, which I was not entirely certain of, stayed back at the building edges and watched. The cargo delivery took 2 hours. Far from V4, in the administrative core of the Galactic Empire's intelligence division, a researcher named Suvin was doing what she did at the end of every long workday, pulling field reports and reading them with the particular, careful attention that had made her the division's fastest-rising analyst in 6 years. She had not expected the report filed by Commander Vreeland of Escort Unit Velshar 7 to be interesting. She had been wrong. She read it once quickly, then a second time slowly, then a third time with a datapad open beside her, so she could annotate the sections that required follow-up. The report was filed in standard Imperial operational language, which was dry and precise, and designed to communicate facts without editorial weight. But facts were Suvin's favorite material, and the facts in this report were extraordinary. 4 human personnel had neutralized a 13-individual ambush in a triple canopy jungle environment during hours of darkness, without casualties, without triggering an enemy communications disruption device that they had identified before its planned activation, without alerting the attacking force to the compromise of their intelligence network, and without requiring the escort commander to commit his 12-soldier professional escort element to the engagement. 4 people. Darkness. Triple canopy jungle. The report described the lead human's behavior in detail that Vreeland had clearly felt compelled to document because it did not fit any existing classification framework he was working from. She had identified the ambush formation from bird behavior. She had moved behind the attacking element in the dark, without equipment superior to standard small arms, and disrupted the formation from its rear. She had communicated with her 3 team members using a frequency that recorded almost no transmissions during the active engagement. They had barely spoken. They had still coordinated perfectly. Suvin flagged the report to her supervisor and pulled up the Earth assessment file. The assessment was 14 months old, filed after the standard biological survey that the Council's auxiliary intake process required. She had read it once when Earth first applied for auxiliary membership and had not returned to it because Tier 2 assessments generally did not generate follow-up work. Now she read it with entirely different eyes. The assessment had been conducted by a survey team that had approached the task the way they approached every biological survey, looking for physical characteristics. They had measured human strength output against comparable species. Average. They had measured sensory acuity. Below average in most categories, with a notable exception in color differentiation, which had no military relevance. They had measured pain tolerance, which was high, but not exceptional. They had looked for venom production, natural armor, exoskeletal density, echolocation capability, and hive coordination. None present. Tier 2. Suvin looked at the survey for a long time. Then she began pulling a different set of files. Not the biological survey. The historical archive. The Galactic Empire's historical archive contained records of every contacted species going back to the earliest expansion period, over 4,000 years ago. For Earth specifically, the archive contained the diplomatic contact record, the survey data, and, because the survey team had been thorough, a digitized sampling of human historical documentation, mostly text, some visual records. Suvin started reading. She started at the beginning of the human historical record, which was fragmentary and ancient, and worked forward chronologically. She was looking for a pattern. She had a hypothesis forming in the back of her mind, the way hypotheses always formed for her, not fully visible yet, but present as a shape that she could sense before she could name. The early records were mostly wars. The middle records were mostly wars. The later records were a combination of technological development, cultural expansion, and also still wars. This was not unusual. Many species had violent expansion phases in their early development. But there was something in the human record that was different from the other violent expansion histories Suvan had studied, and it took her 3 hours of reading to identify it precisely. It was not the frequency of conflict. Other species had higher conflict frequencies. It was the environments. Human conflict records documented fighting in cold environments, hot environments, high-altitude environments, sea-level environments, forested environments, desert environments, Arctic environments, swamp environments, and underground environments. Humans had gone to every place on their planet, every hostile, resource-poor, dangerous place on their planet, and not just survived there, but established permanent settlements, developed regional food systems, and built distinct cultural traditions specific to each environment. They had done this without biological adaptation. The humans who lived in the far northern regions of their planet had not evolved different insulation than the humans who lived in the equatorial zones. They wore different clothing, they built different structures, they learned different skills. They adapted behaviorally rather than biologically, which meant the adaptation was faster and more flexible than biological evolution could ever be. Suvan pulled up a subcategory of the Human Historical Archive, one she almost had not noticed because it was filed under leisure activity rather than military history. Hunting. The file was extensive, much more extensive than she had expected. Humans had been hunting, pursuing other animals for food and other purposes, since the earliest period of their recorded history. The methods documented were extraordinary in their diversity. Traps, nets, long-range projectile weapons of increasing sophistication, scent masking techniques, camouflage, decoy systems, pursuit methods involving following an animal for hours or days until it exhausted itself. Coordinated group hunts using communication signals and prearranged positions. Coordinated group hunts using prearranged positions. She thought about the report. The 4 humans in the jungle, the near-silent communication, the simultaneous neutralization of 2 separate attacking elements by personnel who had not spoken enough words to coordinate it verbally. They had not needed words because they had grown up, culturally, generationally, in a tradition of coordinated group pursuit, where excessive noise defeated the purpose. They had inherited, through training and cultural transmission, the silence of hunters. She pulled a specific subcategory within the hunting archive. Persistence hunting, the practice of following prey not to outrun it, but to outlast it. Humans, who were average in most physical parameters, were exceptional in one capacity, that the biological survey had not flagged as militarily relevant, because it did not look like a weapon. Endurance. The biological survey noted that humans had an unusual cooling system, sweat-based, highly efficient, that allowed them to maintain elevated physical output for extended periods without overheating. The survey team had noted this as a minor metabolic curiosity. Nothing of military significance. Suvan looked at this note for a long time. A species that could maintain high physical output without overheating could pursue a target across great distances and over long periods of time without degrading. A species that had practiced this as a survival and food acquisition strategy for hundreds of thousands of years, since long before the historical record even began, would have built that practice into its psychology, into its patience, into the part of the mind that decided how long to keep going when things were difficult, the part that decided not to stop. She cross-referenced this with the conflict records. The human military history was full of cases where a smaller or less equipped force had maintained operational capacity against a larger or better equipped enemy, not through superior firepower, but through sustained attrition, ambushes, hit and withdraw, long campaigns in difficult terrain. The specific situations in which humans consistently performed above the expectations set by their biological parameters were almost all in complex, difficult, low-visibility environments, jungles, mountains, forests, urban interiors, anywhere that removed the advantage of superior technology by restricting line of sight, disrupting communications, and forcing engagement at close quarters in terrain where patience and terrain knowledge mattered more than raw capacity. Anywhere that looked like a hunt. Suvan sat back from her desk and stared at the ceiling of her office. Then she looked back at the datapad with Vreeland's field report open on it. 4 humans, 13 attackers, triple canopy jungle, night. The 4 humans had gone in and come out whole. The 13 had retreated. She wrote her preliminary assessment in the careful, precise language of Imperial intelligence work, because she knew that the people who would read it would be inclined to dismiss it and she needed to make dismissal as difficult as possible. She wrote, "The current Tier 2 classification of the human species represents a systematic error in the assessment methodology. The biological survey framework measures static physical attributes on the assumption that military capacity derives primarily from biological endowment. This assumption holds for the majority of assessed species, whose dominant survival and conflict strategies align with their biological attributes. It does not hold for humans. Human military capacity derives not from biological attributes but from a suite of behaviorally transmitted adaptations, developed over hundreds of thousands of years of environmental pressure in high-difficulty terrain. These adaptations include terrain reading and environmental integration at expert level, patience and endurance, beyond biological expectation, near-silent coordinated group action, derived from persistent hunting tradition, and a specific psychological profile that does not register unfamiliar or hostile environments as inherently threatening." She paused and read that last phrase back. Does not register unfamiliar or hostile environments as inherently threatening. What she meant was this: most species, when placed in a dangerous, unfamiliar environment, experienced elevated stress responses that degraded cognitive and physical performance. It was a biological survival mechanism, the body's way of prioritizing immediate escape over complex strategic thinking. In most situations, this was appropriate. Humans also had this mechanism, but the human historical record showed a consistent pattern of individuals and groups entering exactly the environments most likely to trigger this response: dark, enclosed, high-threat, low-visibility environments, specifically by choice, for practice, for training, to learn how to function in those conditions until the stress response was no longer in command. The human military tradition called this many things: hardening, conditioning, training under stress. What it produced was an individual who could enter a triple canopy jungle at night, with a 13-person opposing force moving into position around them, and feel, in Suvan's best translation of the human concept she had found in the cultural archive, at home. She included this analysis in the assessment, along with the direct field evidence from Vreeland's report. Then she added one more paragraph, which she wrote carefully and read 3 times before deciding to include it. She wrote, "The most significant finding of this assessment is not that human military capacity has been underestimated. The most significant finding is the reason for the underestimation. The human species does not appear threatening because it is not, in biological terms, threatening. It has no armor, no natural weapons, no physical imposing presence. It appears, to any species assessing it by conventional biological metrics, like prey. The critical error that all such assessments make is the assumption that a species which looks like prey must therefore be prey. Humans developed their adaptive behaviors precisely because they were, in biological terms, disadvantaged in every direct confrontation with the organisms they needed to survive alongside. The capacity for camouflage, patience, terrain reading, and coordinated pursuit that they developed as a result did not make them look more dangerous. It made them look like nothing at all, until the moment it was relevant, at which point the encounter was already decided. She reviewed the full assessment. It was, she thought, the most important intelligence document she had written in 6 years of analysis. She filed it to her department head with a priority flag and a request for immediate forwarding to the Council's Auxiliary Classification Board. Then she sat back and thought about the field report one more time, and specifically about the lead human, Sergeant Mara Voss, who had walked into a jungle in the dark and identified the exact position of every member of the attacking force from the behavior of birds, and then had moved behind the attacking force and neutralized the engagement before the escort team's sensors had detected anything at all. Suvan had spent 6 years studying the documented behavior of every species in the Galactic Compact. She had read records of exceptional individuals from dozens of worlds, warriors of documented and considerable reputation, predators of extraordinary biological capacity. None of the records she had read felt quite like this one, because the warriors she had read about were frightening in recognizable ways. Their capacity was visible. You could look at them and understand, immediately, why they were dangerous. The biological evidence was present, observable, undeniable. Mara Voss looked, in the biological survey images, like someone who worked outdoors and was moderately fit. Suvan looked at the image for a long time. Then she looked at the field report again, at the part where Vreeland had noted, At no point during the engagement did Sergeant Voss raise her voice. She gave no orders during active contact. She moved. Her team moved with her. The engagement was resolved in the time it would take a standard deployment to receive a distress signal. Suvin wrote one more line at the bottom of her assessment, then deleted it, then wrote it again, and left it. She wrote, "Recommend immediate review of all human personnel currently assigned to Tier 2 support roles, with consideration that any environment classified as high-difficulty terrain may be precisely the environment in which human personnel are most effective." She sent the document. Then she went back to the historical archive, to the hunting files, and kept reading. She had a feeling she was only at the beginning of understanding what she was looking at. What Suvin found in the hunting archive kept her at her desk until the building's ambient lighting had shifted through 3 evening cycles without her noticing. She had not intended to spend the night reading about human hunting traditions. She had meant to file her assessment, make her notes, and go home. But every file she opened led to another file, and every cross-reference opened into a wider territory. And she had the feeling, the specific, particular feeling she only got when she was on the edge of something genuinely significant, that she was building a picture of something much larger than a field report from V4. She found the section on tracking. In the hunting archive, a subsection detailed the human practice of following prey across terrain using physical signs: disturbed soil, broken vegetation, patterns in dust or snow, the behavior of other animals in the environment, subtle changes in the way a landscape looked when something had moved through it recently. The human term for this was tracking, and the tradition of it, documented across dozens of separate cultural records from every part of the planet, was deep and sophisticated beyond anything Suvin had expected. The refinement of tracking as a skill set required a specific kind of mind, one that was capable of building a detailed picture of something absent from a collection of small, seemingly unrelated details, and then using that picture to predict future position. It required patience. It required the ability to slow the mind down while the environment spoke, rather than rushing through it looking for obvious signs. It required exactly the kind of systematic, evidence-based reasoning that Suvin herself used in intelligence analysis. She sat with this parallel for a while. She then found the section of the archive covering human military doctrine across recorded history, specifically the subcategory of unconventional and asymmetric operations, smaller forces against larger ones, operating in terrain that favored patience and knowledge over firepower. The historical record here was not merely long, it was consistent in a way that intelligence analysts called a pattern. Humans who were outnumbered in terrain they understood did not lose. Not always, not in every case, but with a frequency that the data made clear was not accidental. They used the terrain. They used patience. They used information gathered before the engagement began. They set the terms of contact wherever possible, and when they could not set the terms, they used the terrain to change the terms after contact was made. In the historical record, the most consistent tactical advantage documented in human military accounts was the element of surprise, not the blunt surprise of a sudden attack, but the precise, engineered surprise of a situation where the opposing force believed it understood the ground it was standing on, and then discovered that it did not. Suvin looked at this, and then looked at Vreeland's field report again, and specifically at the section where he described the lead human's behavior during the engagement. She had gone behind them. She had moved to a position that was not supposed to be occupied, in a direction that the attacking force was not supposed to be threatened from, in the dark, using only the terrain for cover. And the attacking force had not known she was there until she was already resolving the engagement. She had manufactured their surprise. She had decided, before the engagement began, that she would be somewhere the attackers did not expect, and she had moved there, and the engagement had gone the way she had designed it to go. Suvin thought about the council chamber 14 months ago. She had not been present for the original assessment session, but the record was available in the archive. She pulled it up and found the section where the Velkari delegate had delivered the Tier 2 classification to the Earth ambassador. She had read the original assessment at the time, with professional detachment. A new species, biologically unimpressive, no military threat classification warranted, standard result for a standard intake process. She had noted it and moved on. Now she read the delegate's words again, with the field report from V4 open in a parallel window. No military caste, no natural armor, no venom glands, no echolocation, no hive mind coordination. Every single one of these observations was accurate. Suvan was not disputing the observations. The observations were correct. The error was in what the observations meant. The framework assumed that military capacity was a characteristic of what a species was. It never asked what a species had learned to do. I left the camp at the point when the moon position told me it was approximately 2 hours before dawn. The settlement was quiet. The convoy vehicles were secured. The Velkari soldiers were on watch rotation, and their sensors were running their standard sweep pattern. Everything looked exactly as it should look from the outside. From the outside. That was the important part. Deng was already past the camp's north perimeter when I came through the root gap. I knew this because there was a single bent stem on a low-growing plant at the gap's left edge, bent inward, toward the direction of travel, which was his signal to me that he had gone north and found the ground clear. I followed the stem's direction and moved into the jungle. Moving through a jungle at night is a skill that most people assume requires vision. It does not. Vision is helpful, but vision in darkness is limited and unreliable, and a person who depends primarily on vision in a dark jungle is going to be slow, cautious, and loud, because they are using vision to check every step before making it. A person who has spent enough time in dark terrain has learned to move by feel, foot pressure, proprioception, the sensory information that comes through the soles of the boots and the palms of the hands when they brush a root or a trunk. I moved north at a pace slightly faster than careful. The root system under my feet spoke to me. Firm here, soft there. Slope gradient, moisture level, root density. I stepped over things I could not see because I could feel them. I ducked under branches I could not see because the air pressure changed fractionally against my face when something was at head height. It sounds like superstition. It is not superstition. It is the result of practice so long and so repetitive that the nervous system develops shortcuts the conscious mind doesn't have access to until the conscious mind gets out of the way. The hardest part of learning to move in the dark, the part that took me the longest, was learning to stop thinking deliberately and let the body make decisions that the brain was too slow to make in time. I reached the water channel 20 minutes after leaving camp. The crossing point Lena had identified, the deliberate stone arrangement, the worn bank edges, was exactly as she had described it. I crossed in 3 steps, placing my feet on the moved stones without hesitation, and came out on the northern bank without sound and without breaking the surface in a way that would carry downstream. Deng was waiting 12 meters north of the channel, crouched in the root shadow of a large tree. He did not make any signal when I approached. He simply became slightly less still, which was how I knew he had registered my arrival. We moved north together for the next 40 minutes. I followed him, because his read of the ground level sign was sharper than mine in the initial stages. He had been out here longer. He had more data from the specific terrain. He led. I covered the rear and the flanks, reading the jungle to either side, while he read what was directly ahead. The Korveth sign was clear to us both. A well-used path, not physically cleared but navigated so frequently that it had compressed the undergrowth into a defined channel, visible only if you knew what compressed undergrowth looked like versus undergrowth that had been mechanically or chemically cleared. Their footfall pattern was light and careful. These were people who had also learned to move without noise. But light and careful footfall still left evidence for people who knew how to look for it. After 40 minutes, Deng put his fist up. Stop. I stopped. He held the position for 90 seconds. I breathed slowly and listened. Smoke. Very faint. Not current. This was old smoke residue in the air, the kind that clings to vegetation for hours after a fire has been reduced or covered. Cooked food. And underneath both of those, the biological smell of a group of people who had been living in a small area for an extended period. A camp. Close enough to smell, far enough not to see. Deng turned and looked at me and made a small gesture with 2 fingers. 200 meters. He had smelled it first. He always smelled things first. We spent the next 45 minutes covering those 200 meters. Not because the terrain required it, but because approaching an active camp at night required the kind of patience that time pressure made difficult, and that we were now deeply practiced at manufacturing inside ourselves on demand. Every meter was deliberate. Every foot placement was considered. Every pause was used to listen to the layer of sound ahead of us and confirm that the pattern was consistent with a resting camp, rather than an alert one. The camp revealed itself gradually, the way things reveal themselves in the dark, not all at once. but in pieces. A light source first, extremely low level, filtered through material. Then the outline of structures, low, well integrated into the root system, using the natural architecture of the trees as their primary framing. Then the faint sound of communication, very quiet, from a point to the east of the main light source. I counted positions for 15 minutes without moving. The camp was larger than I had expected. Not a mobile forward element. This was a permanent or semi-permanent installation. There were cooking facilities, storage structures, what appeared to be a communications position, and separate sleeping areas distributed across a wide root platform that had been developed over a long period. The natural overhead canopy had been supplemented with woven material that would be invisible from above, even to a low-altitude aerial pass. This was the reason aerial bombardment had not found it. The Empire had been looking for a camp. This looked like part of the jungle. Deng was 10 meters to my left, equally still, watching the eastern arc. His body language told me he had the communication position in view, and was reading it. I counted personnel. It was difficult. The camp was not centrally organized, and the low light made individual identification unreliable. But movement patterns, when I watched them long enough, gave me numbers. At least 30 individuals were present, possibly more. The camp supported a force significantly larger than the ambush element we had encountered. I photographed everything I could with the optical equipment in my field kit, using the light amplification setting at its lowest power draw, to avoid any electronic signature. I documented the structure positions, the approach paths, the water access points, the storage locations. I spent 2 hours doing this from a fixed position, without moving more than the angle of my head. Then, I found what I had really come to find. At the camp's northern edge, a structure that was separated from the others by approximately 30 meters, and had a single, alert guard at its entrance. The guard was not moving with the casual regularity of someone maintaining a routine watch. This guard was alert, present, watching, which meant whatever was inside the northern structure was important enough to maintain active security, even when the rest of the camp was at rest. I did not approach the northern structure. I was here to look, and I had looked. I had the documentation, the personnel count, the structural layout, the water access, and the location of the secured position. I had more than enough. I found Deng by the sound of him exhaling once, very slowly, which was our signal to consolidate. We moved back south together, retracing our path exactly, step for step, and crossed the water channel before the sky above the canopy began to shift from full dark to the earliest gray of pre-dawn. We were back in camp before the Valkyrie morning watch shift began. I sat against the root buttress that I had started to think of as mine, and looked at the documentation on my datapad. 30 personnel minimum, permanent installation, secured structure at the northern edge. I thought about what the old man at the settlement had told me, that the Corveth had brought medicine when the convoy routes were cut, that they had never, in 9 years, touched the medical and food convoys, that they attacked the military supply chain and left the civilian one alone. A force with 30 personnel minimum, permanently installed in the jungle, maintaining a distinction between civilian and military supply interdiction for 9 continuous years. This was not a criminal organization. This was not a random insurgency, fueled by grievance without structure. This was a disciplined, purposeful operation, with a defined mission and a clear ethical framework. I sat with that for a long time. By full morning light, Owen and Lena were awake, and I called the team together in our usual corner. We found the main camp, I said. 30-plus personnel. Permanent installation, well integrated into the terrain. Secured structure at the northern end under active guard. Owen looked alert. Lena was already taking notes. The ambush element we dealt with was a forward detachment, Deng said. The main force is sitting tight, and hasn't moved since we arrived. They're waiting, Owen said. They're watching us, I said. They sent observers last night. I spotted 2 of them at the settlement's eastern perimeter around midnight. They watched the camp for about 2 hours, and then withdrew. They saw standard watch rotation, a standard sensor pattern. They don't know Deng and I were gone. What are they going to do? Lena asked. They're going to decide that the convoy mission is complete, and that the threat element, us, is leaving with the convoy, I said, because that's the logical conclusion. Supply convoy arrives, delivers, departs. We're support personnel. We leave with the convoy. But we're not leaving with the convoy, Owen said. No, I said. Lena looked at me carefully. What's in the secured structure? I don't know yet, I said. But I intend to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mara, we're 4 people. The camp has 30. I know. I'm not saying I won't go, she said. I'm saying I want to be sure we're going for the right reason. The right reason, I said, is that the secured structure tells me something about what the Corvith are protecting, which tells me what this entire operation is actually about. And I don't think it's what the Empire thinks it is. She considered this. You think there's a way to end this without it getting worse? I think there might be, I said. But I need that structure first. Vraylin came to find me an hour later. The convoy drivers were preparing the vehicles for the return journey. He stood with me at the edge of the settlement and spoke quietly. The mission is complete, he said. We return at noon. The convoy returns at noon, I said. My team's mission is not complete. He looked at me. Sergeant Voss, your team's assignment is convoy escort. The convoy is returning. Commander, I said, with respect, I have found the primary operational base of the Corveth force in this sector. I have documented its location, its structure, and its personnel capacity. I have an active intelligence picture of an operation that the Empire has been trying to locate for 3 years from the air and has not found. His expression shifted. I need 48 hours, I said. 48 hours, my team in the field, and then I will give you either a resolution or a complete intelligence package that will actually be useful. He looked at the jungle, at the canopy above us, at the corridor that disappeared into the deep interior. The convoy departs, he said slowly. The convoy escort departs with it. Officially, all personnel are accounted for and returning to base. I waited. If 4 personnel from the support element were to remain at the settlement for additional medical consultations, he said, that would be a medical logistics matter outside my immediate reporting scope. I looked at him. He was looking at the jungle. Thank you, Commander, I said. He walked back toward the convoy without responding. But the set of his shoulders had something in it that I recognized. The posture of someone who had made a difficult decision, and had made the right one, and knew it, and was giving themselves the quiet moment of acknowledging that, before the logistics of the situation required him to move on. I went to find my team. The convoy left at noon. The sound of the vehicles, that grinding, hydraulic, mechanical noise that had been the background of everything since we arrived, diminished into the jungle behind us, and then was gone. What remained was the settlement, the jungle, the 4 of us, and the silence that had been under the convoy noise the entire time, and was now the only sound. The settlement's population watched the convoy go, and then went about their day. The old man from the eastern building did not come out. I had not expected him to. We used the afternoon hours for preparation. This was a habit so deeply ingrained that I did not need to tell the others to do it. Everyone had their process, and the process happened automatically when the time was available. Deng was checking and rechecking his field kit, reducing weight, re-examining his boot soles for wear patterns. Lena was restocking her medical supplies from the small reserve I had asked Vraylan's unit to leave behind, which he had arranged with the medical logistics notation he had mentioned. Owen was doing something careful and precise with a set of small devices I recognized as the disruptor and relay components he had removed from the convoy vehicles. I sat down beside him. What are those going to become? I asked. The disruptor is already dead, he said. But the housing and the power cell are still good. If I pair the power cell with the relay component from Vehicle 6, I can build a passive signal receiver. It won't transmit. It'll just listen. To what? To the Corveth's communication frequency, he said. Their camp-to-camp traffic. I picked up fragments of it last night when I was at the settlement perimeter. It's encrypted, but the encryption is short block, which means with a long enough listening window, I can work out the pattern by hand. By hand, I said. I used to do cryptography puzzles, he said, as a hobby, before this. He looked up at me with that level, calm look of his. I find them relaxing. I sat with this for a moment. How long will the listening window need to be? If they communicate on schedule, which their camp discipline suggests they will, I should have enough material in about 6 hours. Do it, I said. He nodded and went back to his careful, precise work. I spent the afternoon hours in a state that I can only describe as productive quiet. Not meditation. I have never been someone who meditated. Not planning exactly, because the plan was not yet formed enough to examine in detail. It was the particular mental state of active absorption, where the mind is taking in information from the environment and processing it below the surface of conscious thought, building a picture without announcing the building. I walked the settlement's perimeter twice. I noted the vegetation patterns on the jungle edge, the places where the undergrowth had been trimmed back slightly to improve sight lines from the settlement's outer buildings. Not by much, just enough to allow warning of approach. Whoever had done it with care, keeping the modification invisible from a distance. Someone in this settlement had operational experience. I thought about the old man again. I went back to the eastern building and knocked on the open frame at the entrance. He was inside, sitting at a low table, with what appeared to be written documents spread in front of him. He looked up when I came in. "You didn't leave with the convoy," he said. "No," I said. He looked at me for a moment, and then gestured to a position across the table from him. I sat. "The Corveth know you're here," he said. "They saw the convoy leave. They have someone watching the settlement's approach from the northwest." He said this without urgency, the way you state a piece of information that you assume the other person has already considered. "They will know you stayed behind." "I assumed they would," I said. He considered me. "You stayed behind anyway." "I stayed behind because of the staying behind," I said. "If they know I stayed, they'll make decisions based on knowing I stayed. I'd like to see what those decisions are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are using the convoy's departure as a tool." "Everything in the field is a tool," I said. "You use what you have." He looked at the documents on the table. I could see that they were not in any language I recognized. "The Corveth," he said, slowly, "have been in this jungle for 9 years. In that time, the Empire has tried 6 separate operations to remove them. Aerial bombardment 3 times. Ground clearance operations twice. A communications blackout campaign once." He paused. "None of these operations succeeded." "I know," I said. "The Corveth have survived because they know the jungle better than any force the Empire has sent into it," he said. "They know every path, every water source, every position that provides concealment from above. They have built a life here. This is not a tactical position for them. This is their home." "Then why do they let me find it?" I said. He looked at me. "I found their camp last night," I said. "I found it in the dark, from scratch, in a jungle I've been in for 72 hours. They've been here for 9 years, and they couldn't prevent that, which means either their security is significantly weaker than everything else about their operation suggests, or they permitted it." A long silence. I placed the carved marker on the north bank of the water channel at last light, propped against the base of the largest stone in the crossing arrangement, visible from the crossing path but not visible from the south bank. A message left for someone approaching from the north, intended for the eyes of people who were coming, not the eyes of people who were leaving. Then I moved 20 meters east of the crossing point and settled into the undergrowth to wait. Deng was 50 meters west of me, in a position he had selected himself and had described to me in 4 words. Route fork, clear north, which was all I needed to know. Owen had the settlement's perimeter. Lena was in the settlement with her medical kit, and the older man, which was where the most critical work of the night might happen if this went well, or if it went badly, in a specific and recoverable way. The jungle night on V4 was its own particular kind of company. The insect layer, the distant call of things moving in the upper canopy, the water sound of the channel nearby. I had been in this jungle for 4 nights now, and its rhythms were no longer foreign to me. I knew what the normal sound architecture was. I would know when something entered it that changed the pattern. I sat in the dark, and I did not move, and I let the jungle settle back around me, the way it always settled around a human who was still enough and patient enough for long enough. The wait was 2 hours and 40 minutes. The change in the jungle's pattern was subtle. A brief pause in the insect layer to the north. Not silence, just a fractional reduction in density, the way sound thins when something large passes through the territory of the things making it. Then, 10 minutes later, the water sound of the channel changed. A crossing. Careful. Deliberate. Using the stone arrangement. 1 set of feet. A scout. The scout found the marker. There was a pause at the crossing. I could identify it by the absence of further water sound and the presence of absolute stillness at that specific point for approximately 90 seconds. Then the sound of movement, not south toward the settlement, but back north across the channel. Returning to report, I waited. 40 minutes later, 2 sets of feet at the channel crossing. Not coming south immediately. Pausing at the north bank. The scout had brought 1 other person and they were both looking at the marker. A conversation, too low to carry through the ambient sound, happening at the north bank. Then one set of feet crossed south. Alone. I stayed in position and let the single individual come south, until they reached the point where the crossing path opened into a slightly wider ground space. A natural pause point. A place where someone coming from the north would naturally stop and look before proceeding. It was approximately 15 meters from the channel. When the individual reached that point, I said clearly, in the common tongue, "I am here. I am not armed toward you." The individual stopped. There was a silence that lasted about 5 full seconds. Then a voice, also in the common tongue, said, "Where?" 10 meters east of you. In the undergrowth, I said. "I can step out, or you can walk toward me. Either way works." Another pause. Then, "Step out." I stood, and stepped out of the undergrowth. I had my rifle across my back on its sling, not in my hands. I kept my hands at my sides, relaxed, visible. The individual facing me was taller than I had expected, approximately 2 meters, with a build that suggested long-term physical activity in an environment that required both strength and endurance. The face was partially obscured by low-level camouflage material, but the eyes were visible, and they were doing exactly what mine had been doing for 4 nights, reading the ground, reading me, building a picture. "You placed the marker," the individual said. "Yes," I said. "The elder told you the marker's meaning. He told me it was an invitation to talk rather than engage," I said. "That's why I placed it." A pause. "You found our camp 2 nights ago." "Yes. We knew you were there." The voice was level. "Matter of fact, we saw you at the water channel before you crossed. We tracked you from the crossing to the observation position you took southeast of the main structure line. I thought about this. You were monitoring the camp from the outside. We maintain external observation of the camp perimeter as a standard security measure," the individual said. "We saw you approach. We saw where you positioned yourself. We observed your documentation work. You let me work," I said. "We had a decision to make about you," the individual said. "The decision required information. The best way to gather information about what a thing intends is to watch what it does when it believes it is unwatched." This stopped me slightly. It was a very precise and accurate statement of an intelligence-gathering principle that my training had also given me, stated by someone who had arrived at the same principle through a completely different path, in a completely different context, on a world that had never heard of my training program. "What did you decide?" I said. "We decided," the individual said, "that you are not what the Empire usually sends into this jungle." "No," I said, "I'm not. You moved through the jungle at night, without the equipment the Empire uses to compensate for the inability to navigate without it," the individual said. "You did not use your sensors. You did not use active light sources. You crossed the channel using the stone arrangement, as if you had known it was there for longer than 2 nights. I read the bank," I said. "The crossing point was visible from the soil compression and the stone positions." A pause. "You read the crossing point from soil compression. And the angle of the stones," I said. "The way they're oriented tells you that they were positioned for an approach from the north, not the south. The compression pattern on the north bank is deeper than the south, more foot traffic coming from that direction. The bank itself has been reinforced against erosion, which means the crossing has been in use for a long time." I paused. "How long?" 7 years, the individual said. 7 years. The settlement had been here for 11. The Corvette had been here for 9. The crossing had been in use for 7. "You've been resupplying the settlement through that crossing," I said. A longer pause. The individual's eyes did not change, but something in their posture shifted fractionally. Not defensiveness, exactly. More like the specific adjustment of someone who has just confirmed that the person they are talking to has correctly assembled the picture they thought they had successfully kept hidden. "You know what we are," the individual said. "Not quite a question. I know what you're protecting," I said. "I know about the deep interior population. I know what the northern structure in your camp is for. I know about the convoy manifest reading, and the selection criteria you use to decide which convoys to interdict and which to allow through." The silence that followed was long. "The Empire does not know this," the individual said. "The Empire classified you as a nuisance rebel faction," I said. "Their intelligence on your operation is based on aerial observation and sensor sweeps. It tells them where you've been, but not what you're doing, or why. They've been trying to find your camp from above. They don't understand what they're actually looking at, and you do." "I think so," I said. I could be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. Another long pause. The jungle moved around us in its quiet, layered way. Somewhere in the canopy above, something shifted branches in the dark. The water channel murmured to our north. What do you intend to do with what you know? The individual asked. This was the question. The actual question. The one that this entire conversation had been building toward, and the one that I had been considering since the old man had told me about the medical facility and the deep interior population. That depends on what you want, I said, and on whether there's a solution here that doesn't involve the Empire sending a larger and more serious force into this jungle to do what the aerial bombardment and the ground clearance operations didn't manage. The individual was still. The Empire will not stop, I said, not because they're certain you're a threat, but because an unresolved situation in a sector they administer is an institutional problem. They will keep sending forces until the problem is resolved. The only question is how the resolution happens. And you think you can influence that resolution, the individual said. I think I can give your situation a better advocate than it currently has, I said, which right now is no advocate at all, because the Empire doesn't know what your situation is. A pause. You would advocate for us. I would tell the truth about what I've found here, I said. What the Empire does with the truth is not my direct control. But true information given to the right people moves differently than no information or wrong information. The individual looked at me for a long time. You are very calm about this, they said. I've been in jungles before, I said. They tend to clarify things. The faintest shift in the individual's posture, something that I interpreted, given the context and the evidence available to me, as a nearly invisible acknowledgement of something like humor. Come to the camp, the individual said. Tomorrow. Morning. Bring your team. All four. All four, I said. We want to see what you are, they said. Together. You move differently from one another, and the same as each other. We want to understand how that works. We'll come at dawn, I said. The individual stepped back into the undergrowth and was gone. Not gradually, completely. One moment present, the next not there. I stood and listened to the water channel, and the insects, and the distant canopy sounds for a full 2 minutes, and at no point did I hear movement heading north. They had moved without making sound, over that ground, in the dark. I stood in the open space near the channel for a moment longer. They were watching us, they said. They had watched us from the moment we arrived. They had read our behavior the way I had read the crossing point, from evidence, from pattern, from the accumulation of small details into a coherent picture. They had decided to talk. I went back to where Deng was waiting in the root fork. One individual came south, I said, very quietly. Senior, they want to meet. Tomorrow morning, the camp, all four of us. Deng thought about this for a moment. They could simply have taken us then, if that was their intent, he said. Yes, I said. So this is a genuine conversation. I think so, I said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the jungle. 9 years in this terrain, he said softly. They move well. They do, I said. How well? I heard them cross the channel, I said. I didn't hear them return. He turned and looked at me. In the dark, his face was mostly unreadable, but I knew him well enough to interpret the angle of his head. He was impressed. Deng was not easily impressed. What do you think they are? He said. I think they're protecting people who can't protect themselves, I said. And I think they've been doing it for a very long time, in a very difficult environment, and it's made them into something that the Empire's classification system doesn't have a category for. He looked at the jungle for a moment. Sounds familiar, he said. Yes, I said. It does. We moved back to the settlement in the quiet before dawn, and I sat down against my root buttress for the last time that night, and I thought about morning and what it might bring, and I felt the particular, specific quality of readiness that came before something important. Not fear, not excitement, but the clean, clear, settled awareness of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly the thing they are supposed to be doing. The jungle breathed around me. I breathed with it. Owen had cracked the communication frequency by the time I returned. He was sitting by the settlement's water point with his data pad on his knee, and that particular expression of complete absorption that he wore when a problem had fully given itself over to him. 4 hours of passive listening, he said, without looking up. The encryption protocol is block-based and sequential. Once you have the first 2 blocks in context, the rest follows a mathematical pattern that you can run in your head given enough time. And you had enough time. I said. I had 4 hours, and a very quiet jungle, he said. The frequency carries logistics traffic, supply requests, personnel movements, time-stamped position checks, medical requisitions. He paused on the last one. There are a lot of medical requisitions. I know why, I said. He looked up at me then. I told him about the conversation at the channel crossing. I told him about the old man, and the northern structure, and the deep interior population that the Corveth were sustaining. I told him that we had been invited to the camp in the morning. Owen listened the way Owen always listened, very still, processing each piece of information with the careful attention of someone who was building a structural understanding of it, rather than just cataloging the facts. The medical frequency volume, he said when I had finished. It's consistent with a sustained care operation for 300 to 400 individuals. That matches what the elder told me, I said. Some of the medical requisitions reference pediatric dosing, he said. He said it without emphasis, in the same level, professional tone he used for all operational information. But there was something underneath the tone that I recognized, the particular quality that crept into Owen's voice when he had identified something that altered the moral weight of a situation. Children. I know, I said. Lena was awake and sitting at the doorway of the building she had been using, and I knew from the angle of her head that she had heard most of this. She had a way of positioning herself that made her appear to be resting, while actually being alert to everything in a 40-meter radius, which was a quality that I had first noticed about her during our second deployment together, and had appreciated every day since. Tomorrow morning, she said. The camp. All 4, I confirmed. Do we know what we're walking into? She asked. We know they could have ended this conversation last night at any point, I said. They had the numbers and the terrain advantage. They chose not to. They could be saving it for when all 4 of us are in one location, Owen said, in the tone of someone identifying a possibility, rather than expressing a belief. They could be, I said. But the intelligence picture doesn't support that. A force that has been running a sustained care operation for 9 years in a jungle, protecting a civilian population with no legal standing, taking significant operational risk to do it. That is a force with a very specific set of priorities. Those priorities don't include trapping 4 support personnel from a supply convoy escort. I paused. They want to understand us. They've been watching us, and they've made a decision that we're worth talking to. That's what this is. Deng, sitting against the building's outer wall, said, the way they move, the way they track. They've been doing this for a long time. Longer than we have, I said. Not longer than we have, he said. Differently than we have. They know this specific terrain. We know terrain in general. He paused. It's not the same thing, but it's related. I thought about this. He was right. The Corveth force had 9 years of accumulated knowledge of the Vithara interior. Every path, every water source, every position, every seasonal change in the canopy. That depth of local knowledge was a form of mastery that could not be replicated by skill alone, no matter how skilled you were. It required time. What we had was different. We had the training, the underlying framework of environmental reading, movement, patience, and observation that could be applied to any high-complexity terrain, quickly, and rebuilt from scratch in a new environment, within days. Not 9 years of specific knowledge, but the tools to build knowledge rapidly, wherever we landed. 2 different kinds of expertise. Related enough to recognize each other. I slept for 3 hours, and woke at first light with the alarm I had set in my internal clock, through the simple mechanism of deciding what time I would wake up, and then waking up at that time, which was a habit developed over 11 years of field work, in conditions where electronic alarms were not always an option. The 4 of us ate from our field rations at the settlement's edge, as dawn built slowly down through the canopy layers. The light came in stages. First, the very highest canopy edges going from black to deep green, then the mid-level showing its shapes, then the lowest level, emerging from complete darkness into the layered gray-green of V4's morning. It was a slow, deliberate, beautiful process. I watched it every morning here, and had not once stopped finding it worth watching. Ready? I said. 3 nods. No further discussion needed. We moved north. The same path as 2 nights ago, but now in morning light, which changed the jungle's character significantly. The same trees, the same root systems, the same dense undergrowth, but all of it legible now, in a way that the dark had made interpretive. The council chamber felt different the second time. It was the same room. the same elevated seating, the same amphitheater geometry, the same acoustic system, the same recycled air that smelled faintly of whatever passed for cleaning products in an imperial administrative building, the same delegates from the same worlds, with the same arranged expressions of diplomatic attention. But I was not in the translator booth this time. This time I was standing at the central address platform, where Colin Ward had stood 14 months ago, with my field documentation on the data stand beside me, and the translator earpiece in my left ear, and the knowledge of exactly what was in my report, and exactly what it was going to do to the frameworks that this room operated inside. Colin was in the observation gallery. He had asked me, before the session opened, if I was ready. I had told him I was. He had looked at me for a moment and said, "They're going to push back." I had said, "I know." He had nodded and gone to his seat, and I had come to the platform. The session opened with standard procedural language from the session chair, a species I had not encountered before, small and precise, with excellent posture, and the particular quality of total impartiality that made very good chairs. The session was registered as a field assessment review, which was a category that sat in the Council's operational business rather than its policy business, and which meant that the delegates were required to listen to the field report before they could engage in deliberation, which meant I had the floor, for however long the report required. I began. 14 months ago, I said, Earth was assessed at Tier 2 of the Peacekeeping Auxiliary classification. The assessment was accurate based on the criteria applied. I am not contesting the assessment. I am here to provide a field report that contains information the assessment framework is not currently equipped to process, and to recommend a modification to that framework. I paused. The chamber was quiet. My team of 4 personnel was assigned to escort a supply convoy through the Vithara interior on planet V4, I said. The operational situation in that sector included a long-standing rebel faction, designated Corveth, which had been interdicting military supply chains for 3 years. 3 years of aerial bombardment had not located the Corveth primary base. 2 ground clearance operations had not made contact with their main force. A communications blackout campaign had not disrupted their operations. I looked across the chamber. The Velkari delegate, the one from 14 months ago, with the six-toothed smile, was in his elevated seat. His expression was attentive and neutral. In 72 hours of ground-level operation, I said, my team located the Corveth primary installation, neutralized an ambush that the convoy escort's sensor equipment failed to detect, compromised the Corveth intelligence network operating within the convoy vehicles, and established direct communication with the Corveth leadership. I let that sit for a moment. The field assessment phase lasted an additional 48 hours after the convoy departed. During that phase, my team and I met with Corveth leadership at their primary installation and gathered the intelligence required to understand what the Corveth operation actually is. I opened the first section of my documentation. It is not a rebel faction. It is not a military insurgency. It is a protection and support operation for a civilian population of approximately 400 individuals in the deep Vethara interior. Individuals who have no formal recognition under Imperial Compact, no legal status, and no access to any supply chain, medical service, or administrative protection. The chamber was very quiet now. A different kind of quiet from 14 months ago. That quiet had been laughter waiting to happen. This quiet was attention. The Corveth have been sustaining this population for 9 years, I said. They interdict military supply convoys, which they then redistribute as medical and logistical support to the interior population. In 9 years, they have never once interdicted a medical or food convoy. The record is clear and documented. They have a specific, observable selection criterion for engagement, and that criterion is entirely consistent with their stated mission of protecting the interior population. I advanced to the next section of the documentation. The imperial classification of the Corveth as a military insurgency is based on incomplete intelligence gathered exclusively through aerial observation. That intelligence is accurate in what it describes. It is incomplete in what it fails to describe. This is not an intelligence failure in the usual sense. It is a structural limitation of the assessment methodology, which was designed to identify military threat posture and did so correctly. It was not designed to identify the humanitarian function underlying the military posture, because the assumption was that such a function did not exist. I looked at the Velkari delegate. He was not laughing. He was watching me with the careful, measuring attention of a person who has encountered something he had not planned for. The recommendation in this report, I said, is threefold. First, that the Imperial Compact institute a formal recognition process for the interior population of V4, establishing their legal status and connecting them to the supply and medical systems they have been excluded from. Second, that the Corvith operation be reclassified from military insurgency to civilian protection force, with a negotiated operational agreement that permits their continued function in the interior while ending the military supply interdiction. Third, that the peacekeeping auxiliary classification framework be revised to include an assessment category for behavioral and cultural adaptive capacity, separate from biological attribute assessment, which more accurately captures the operational capacity of species whose military effectiveness derives from training and tradition rather than biological endowment. I paused. The third recommendation, I said, is the one I am most personally invested in, because the reason my team was able to accomplish in 72 hours what 3 years of Imperial operations had not accomplished is precisely the thing that the classification framework does not currently measure. We were effective, not because we are biologically formidable. We are not. We were effective because we have spent a very long time learning how to operate in complex, hostile, low-visibility environments, and that learning is transmitted through our culture from birth, and it produces a type of operational capacity that looks, to any biological assessment, like nothing at all, and functions, in the field, like something the existing tier system does not have a category for. I closed the documentation. I will take questions, I said. The questions came from 8 delegates in sequence, and they ranged from the technical, specific queries about the convoy intelligence devices, the camp location, the communication frequency, to the structural, which were the ones that mattered. The structural questions were all, in various forms, asking the same thing. How did force support personnel do what 3 years of Imperial operations had not? I answered each question directly and without embellishment. The answers were in the documentation. The documentation was specific and verifiable. I had brought Vreeland's field report, my own field notes, Owen's frequency analysis, Lena's medical assessment of the Northern Structure Facility, and Deng's tracking log, which was a document of exceptional precision and detail that described, in 300 pages of hand-noted observation, what the Vethara interior looked like to someone who could read it. 300 pages. Deng had compiled it from memory during the 6-hour window before our return transport, sitting in the settlement with a datapad, writing down everything he had seen and read and understood about the interior during our 5 days there. The session chair had said, when I submitted the documentation package for pre-session review, that it was the most comprehensive field intelligence package they had processed, from a 4-person support element in their administrative tenure. I had thanked them, and said that Deng was very thorough. The 8th question came from the Velkari delegate. He did not ask about the operation. He asked about the classification framework. Sergeant Voss, he said. His voice was careful and measured, and very different from the voice he had used 14 months ago. Your recommendation regarding the classification framework. The 3rd recommendation. Are you suggesting that the current framework, biological attribute assessment, is wrong? I am suggesting that it is incomplete, I said. It is accurate for what it measures. It does not measure everything that determines operational effectiveness. And the category you would add, he said, behavioral adaptive capacity, how would you assess it? I would assess it the way you assess any capability, I said, by watching it operate, by looking at what a species does in high-difficulty terrain over extended periods of time, and measuring the gap between what the biological assessment predicts and what the operational record shows. He was quiet for a moment. And for Earth, he said, what does that gap show? It shows, I said, that 4 personnel classified at the lowest functional military tier of the auxiliary, located, made contact with, and opened diplomatic negotiation with, a force that had evaded 3 years of Imperial military operations. I paused. The gap is significant. He was quiet for a longer moment. The chamber was very still. I could see, in the gallery above, Colin Ward, sitting with his hands folded on the railing in front of him, watching. The council will deliberate on your recommendations, the session chair said. Thank you, I said. I stepped back from the platform and walked out of the center of the chamber and took a seat in the observer section. My hands were steady. My breathing was controlled. I felt exactly the way I always felt after a mission had reached its resolution point. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. something quieter than both of those. The deliberation took 4 days. On the second day, Suvan's assessment arrived at the classification board's desk. I learned this later, from Colin, who tracked the document's journey through the administrative system with the patient. Careful attention of a diplomat who understood that paperwork was also a form of terrain, and that reading it correctly was as important as reading a jungle. On the third day, Commander Vreeland submitted a supplementary field report that had not been requested. The supplementary report contained, in formal Imperial operational language, a detailed account of every observation he had made during the 5-day mission. It was a longer document than his original report. Much longer. He had, apparently, been thinking about what he had witnessed, and the thinking had produced material. At the end of the supplementary report, in the section reserved for Commander's personal assessment, he had written, "The human team's performance in the Vithara interior represents a category of operational effectiveness that the current auxiliary framework is not equipped to classify. I recommend that the Council give serious consideration to developing a new assessment category. I also recommend that the next time a mission involves a complex terrain environment with an active opposing force, Earth personnel are considered for primary operational designation rather than support designation. This recommendation is based entirely on what I observed. I do not make it lightly." On the 4th day, the Council delivered its response. The interior population of V4 would receive formal recognition under Imperial Compact. A supply and medical access agreement would be negotiated. The Corveth operation would be reclassified, pending the outcome of negotiated agreements, as a civilian protection force with provisional recognized status. The classification framework would be reviewed by a joint committee including, at the committee chair's specific request, representation from Earth, and Earth's auxiliary classification would be held pending the committee's findings, in a category that the Council had designated, in the interim record, as under review, assessment framework insufficient for determination, which was not exactly Tier 10, but it was not Tier 2 either. Colin found me outside the chamber when the session closed. He was a calm man by nature and by long professional practice, and he showed it now, his expression composed and deliberate, with the particular look of someone who has just received good news and is processing it at the appropriate measured speed. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. "The committee representation," he said. "They'll want you on it." "Probably," I said. "Will you go?" he said. I thought about the council chamber, and the translation booth, and the laugh that had made the room go quiet 14 months ago. I thought about V4, and the jungle, and the water channel, and the carved piece of wood from the old man, and Kale at the camp entrance in the morning light. I thought about Deng reading a crossing point in the dark, and Owen breaking an encryption protocol by hand, and Lena walking into the northern structure, and immediately going to the inventory, because that was what you did when you saw a medical situation that needed more than it had. I thought about what my grandfather had told me at the edge of a forest when I was 11 years old and we were waiting for dawn. The animal that thinks you are not a threat has already made the decisive mistake. "Yes," I said. "I'll go." Colin nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the chamber's closed doors. Then he said, carefully, "The Velkari delegate, at the end of the session. Did you see his face when the session chair announced the committee composition?" "I saw it," I said. "He wasn't laughing," Colin said. "No," I said. "He was not." We stood outside the chamber in the recycled air of the Imperial Administrative Building, and I thought about the 250,000 years of pressure and patience and practice that had built, without any of us knowing it was being built, the specific set of capabilities that had brought us from a small world at the edge of a galaxy to a council chamber where the galaxy was now revising what it had thought it understood about us. We had not looked dangerous. We had never looked dangerous. We were soft and unarmored and biologically unremarkable, and we had looked, to every species that had ever assessed us, like something that should be careful about the dark. We were not careful about the dark. We had spent 250,000 years walking into the dark and studying it until we understood every shadow in it, and the dark had never once succeeded in holding us. 4 people had gone into a jungle that 3 years of Imperial military operations had not resolved, and 4 people had come out with a diplomatic outcome, a medical partnership, and a report that was rewriting a classification framework that the galaxy had been using for 4,000 years. We were not prey. We had never been prey. We had just been waiting for someone to be confused enough by the difference between what we looked like and what we were to give us a problem worth solving. The galaxy had laughed. We had gone to work. I looked up through the administrative building's skylights at the stars beyond the station's outer shell, at the particular cold and silent light of a galaxy that was, slowly and with difficulty, and with the specific institutional reluctance of any large body that has been wrong about something, beginning to revise its understanding. I thought, we are only getting started. I thought, wait until they see what we do next. I turned from the skylights and went to find my team, because there would be another assignment, and another jungle, and another problem that looked impossible until 4 humans who had grown up learning the language of difficult terrain walked into it and made it simple, and I intended to be ready. We were always ready. That was the thing the galaxy was still learning about us, and the thing I hoped it would remember long after the laughter had faded, and the classification frameworks had been rewritten, and the council records had been updated, and the laugh in that chamber was just a footnote in the long, unfinished, extraordinary story of what humans had turned out to be. We were always, in any jungle, on any world, under any sky, in any dark, ready. The committee met for the first time, 3 weeks after the council session, in a smaller room on the administrative station's 4th tier. The room was designed for working sessions rather than formal proceedings. Lower ceilings, practical furniture, a large data display on the central wall that could show documentation, footage, or data analysis, depending on what was needed. 6 committee members plus a recording officer. 3 species represented, including Earth. Earth's representation was Colin Ward, as senior diplomatic contact, and me, as the designated field assessment specialist, which was a title I had not previously held, and which had been created specifically for this committee, which was itself a sign of how quickly the council moved when it decided something was urgent. The first session lasted 11 hours. We covered the classification framework's history, its original design criteria, the species assessments it had generated over 4,000 years, and the statistical gap between predicted and actual performance for species with high behavioral adaptability and low biological endowment. Suvan was there. She was not on the committee. She was the Intelligence Division's designated observer, which meant she sat along the side wall with her datapad and did not speak unless asked a direct question. But she was there, and when I walked in on the first morning and saw her, something crossed her face that I recognized as the expression of a person who has been studying something in documents for weeks and is now in the same room as the actual thing. She looked at me the way she might look at a data point that had just stood up and introduced itself. I nodded at her. She nodded back. At the first break, she came to where I was standing at the room's side table with a cup of something hot and said, in the common tongue, with the slight careful cadence of someone whose first language it was not, "You are shorter than I expected." "I get that a lot," I said. "The field documentation," she said,